Best practice for Switch 2 wired headphone users. Ideals for games that require reacting to sounds such as fishing in Animal Crossing or music rhythm. If you use wired headphones, please connect the Pro 2 controller via USB to the dock or console, then use the controller's headphone jack. I prefer to use the dock's USB port, but for the most part the Switch 2's top USB-C port makes no difference in latency. Or, use the Switch 2 console's headphone jack regardless if you're using a wired or wireless controller. Do not use the Switch 2 Pro controller's headphone jack while the controller is wireless. You literally change from the best to the worst experience just by disconnecting that USB cable between the console and controller. You can verify this yourself in the Switch 2's home menu just by seeing how much worse the delay is of the clicking sounds. There is a chance that your TV, even with its game mode active or a USB DAC, will add lag.
Last minute edit. I did time with virtual surround on and off as well. For Megamix, it made no difference. But maybe in Tears of the Kingdom, which supports 5.1, it did actually add a slight delay. Either way, if you're paranoid and really want that 5 milliseconds, you can disable virtual surround.
That is the findings of 2001 button presses to sound effects, measured on Switch 2. Live demonstration.
This is the best setup for the least audio delay for Switch 2. I'm using the Pro 2 controller's headphone jack, but what is critical when doing so is that you also have it wired via USB to the Switch 2. It doesn't matter if it's the dock or the Switch 2 itself. Put that down nicely. To demonstrate the delay, actually this is connected to my field recorder and so is the microphone you're listening to right now. So when I press A, you can hear the delay. And to demonstrate how critical the USB cable is, as soon as I disconnect that, listen to how horrible that delay's become now. Now let's just reconnect that. Much better. So to reiterate, if I have a look at controllers and accessories, you can see here that it's connected via USB. If I go to audio, you can see it's using the Switch 2 Pro controller audio. So, yeah. And this is what I did for the tests themselves for the whole chart. So I just basically retry and I was recording the GR button underneath. And again, if I disconnect the cable, yeah, I'm not trying to be perfect with the notes, but at least I can measure. Cool. Alternatively, you can connect your headphones to the Switch 2 itself.
It was at this moment I knew.
One would think that this conclusion is obvious. However, historically, I got the opposite of that. Switch 2 is way more consistent than Switch 1, PS4, and PS5. I tested a bunch of setup combinations to isolate causes for delay. From the Switch 2 side, the only thing that really adds delay is the wireless Pro 2 controller's audio. My fastest DAC and display doesn't add audio lag. However, my flagship OLED Panasonic 2023 TV and best sounding Chord Mojo 2 DAC amps do. Talking numbers, The Switch 2 at its best will sit around 85 to 90 milliseconds for average latency. The Wireless Pro 2 shifts that to an insane 255 milliseconds. If you have Hodi's Megamix controller for Switch 1, the headphone jack becomes usable on Switch 2. Before, it added about 33 milliseconds lag, but now either none or at worst 5 milliseconds. My sample size could be the culprit of that 5 milliseconds difference readout. Either way, I doubt you could win in a blind test comparison. I got a 25 millisecond average variation. For example, if the fastest measurement in one test was 70 milliseconds, the slowest in that same test was 95. 25 milliseconds is still virtually impossible to distinguish. Anyone watching has probably gamed long enough to say they've never noticed. Audibly, that gap sounds this long. And in practice, here's what that sounds like, comparing a fast and slow button press to hearing game audio. Can you tell if the first or second recording was faster? My test method. Enjoy this smartphone footage. Alright, so this is just to show what the test setup actually is. So what I have here is a microphone very close to these big buttons. It goes through the microphone to the field recorder in channel 3. So it's quite low in volume at the moment because the buttons themselves are loud. So when I start hitting them, you'll see it's actually registering the sound, and then through these two cables it's rigged as a stereo sound through to the Switch 2's headphone jack. So when I enable that, and I'll disable the other microphone, so that's the button sounds in the game. In the game itself, I've disabled the audio track. It's in Japanese, but so BGM, that's the song, it's gone. The rhythm button noises is maximum. Other sound effects are off. So I'm just recording the button sounds from the game. You could do the same thing with the home menu. But yeah, so this will be capturing the audio at the same time for both the Switch and the microphone. So the delay should only be basically the sound wave traveling from here to here. For the majority of the tests, what I actually used was the Pro controller. And I didn't use the face buttons because these ones are not very clicky, but actually the GR buttons can be more clicky sounding. So I've just held that close to the microphone, and that was the majority of the tests. So most people would probably have access to the Pro controller and the Switch 2, not this giant behemoth thing, but yeah. I have now seen around the first 1.5 minutes of the song Yellow more times than I care to count. I measured the waveform from a notable spike in the controller button press click to the first peak in the game's sound. I used the spike as it's easier to read than the start of the waveform moving. Background noise and such. Key thing is I'm consistent, and actually this selection here is what 1 millisecond looks like. This does mean that maybe the true delay is a few milliseconds different, but that doesn't affect the goal here. Best practice. Of course, a 0 millisecond delay is ideal, but it's not achievable. A good realistic average is around 50 milliseconds, which I personally can only obtain with a PS4. 85 to 90 milliseconds is okay, but not great. Unfortunately, this is about the best you can get with both the new Switch 2 and the Switch 1. I found that the arcade cabinet for the same game is roughly 40 milliseconds. That's between a 31 and 49 millisecond delay, very fast. Best practices for other consoles? For Switch 1, use the console's headphone jack and detach the Joy-Cons or the Pro controller. Although there is no headphone jack on the controller, when you use wired communication, including the Joy-Cons being attached to the side of the undocked Switch, it actually adds about a 15 millisecond audio delay. Thankfully, the Switch 2 doesn't do this. Third-party controllers with headphone jacks probably add lag. Hodi's wired one does anyway. For PS5 Pro, you're losing alternative options. Ultimately, you just want a TV or display with no lag. Hello again, smartphone footage. Here's my personal setup for the lowest audio delay for PS5 and PS5 Pro. My TV adds significant audio delay, so to circumvent this, I've connected the PS5 Pro here to the Ninja V recorder as well as my headphones, as the Ninja V has very little or no audio input lag. I tried the headphones connected directly to this controller, but not only did it sound more muffled, I could immediately tell it was slower. Now, I could be playing straight off this tiny screen here, but you do see it is both inputting and outputting at 4K to this TV. Now, let's check the delay between these two devices by timing or counting how many frames between the two, which I can do by pressing this button here, which the light will turn off, and then we will retry the song, which display will turn white first. Oh, let's try again just in case. Check between a UAC Class 1 USB DAC and your display. That's a USB DAC that supports up to 96 kHz. Anything above that will be UAC 2, likely doesn't support UAC 1 standards, therefore won't be detected by the PS5. The controller's audio jack at its best is pretty bad, but maybe your TV is even worse. The PS5's situation for USB DACs really sucks, as 2 of the 3 DACs I have are Class 2, which the PS5 doesn't support. For PS4, if you use the newer ZCT2 model controller, if you have to use the controller's headphone jack, don't enable USB communication, as it's noticeably slower. The best setup would be through a zero latency display via HDMI, or through a zero latency amplifier that supports an optical cable, something the PS5 doesn't have. If you're wondering, this is what the PS4's 50 millisecond average delay sounds like compared to the Switch 2's average 85. Originally I was going to make a 2-minute video on this, but clearly I couldn't help but dive deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole, thus making it longer. As I reflected while editing this video, the one thing that never left my mind is that the newer consoles with their fancy rendering techniques like PSSR and TVs with their virtual surround sound and whatnot are falling behind in audio latency. Gaming devices and TVs should strive for the best gaming modes by decreasing audio latency as low as humanly possible. This plays a big part on how responsive gaming feels. We shouldn't be accepting 90 milliseconds, 100 milliseconds, 250 milliseconds audio delay. We should be aiming for 50, 40 or less. Personally, I would love to go back to RCA out and have my console hooked up to an analog mixer, avoiding as much digital processing as possible. Background. Stop saying background.